I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Becky Bigler, but please feel free to still get food and find your seats whenever you're ready. I'm stereotype Anders, and I'm an associate professor of psychology and women's studies and a bunch of other areas at the university. And I'm also area chair of our gender and feminist psychology area here in the psychology department. And it's really my delight to, for our area to be able to host Dr. Becky Bigler to speak, along with our combined program in psychology and education, the Center for Human Growth and Development, and our developmental psychology area. So lots of people are really interested and excited to have Dr. Bigler here. Now, Dr. Bigler is a professor of psychology and women's and gender studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She's very highly cited with over 20 papers having more than 100 citations. And her work is published in some of the top journals, for example, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, Child Development, Developmental Psychology, and so on. Her research looks at how children understand and categorize based on gender and race, and she's interested also in how we can do work that ameliorates some of the problematic aspects of that process. Her work is featured nationally in the media, for example, multiple public radio stations, Parents Magazine, the New York Times, Newsweek, USA Today, and Good Morning America. And I also want to say, I heard Dr. Bigler speak at the Gender Development Research Conference about a decade ago, when I was still a graduate student, and it was really one of the most formative talks I'd ever heard. My PhD is in behavioral neuroscience, so it's very different, but hearing her talk and her passion really had a formative experience for me. And then I had the delight to be on a panel with her again this summer, or not again, but to hear her talk again when we were on a panel together this summer. And again, it was like, oh my gosh, this matters so much. We all need to be hearing it. So I was really excited that Dr. Bigler was so generous to be so delighted to give, she's giving an academically focused talk tomorrow and then this public talk so that folks in the community, teachers, educators, and parents could hear some of the important things that in research that is going on and that Dr. Bigler herself is doing. So please help me welcome Dr. Bigler.
All right, I'm going to turn the mic on, and so is that okay? Everyone can hear? Wonderful. I am so delighted to be here, and the introduction was so nice, in part because I can honestly say inspiring younger scholars is the most wonderful, meaningful, important thing that I do in my work. So I am so delighted to hear anybody listen to a talk and was inspired. Briefly, my background is in studying stereotyping and prejudice over the last 26 years at the University of Texas. I have tried to understand the process by which children become biased about different social categories. I have focused most often on race and gender, but done work on some other categories as well. And along with those years of studying how kids become stereotypers and biased, I have tried to understand how to reduce stereotyping and prejudice. So I have had a commitment to intervention from my very first study in graduate school, which was an intervention, all the way through. And I attribute that somewhat to my academic training and my sources of inspiration. I went to Oberlin College and very much internalized the commitment to social justice and to making a better world as the point of research. So I do my work with that as the goal for sure. And I'm going to focus tonight on intervention, the things parents and teachers can do to prevent and reduce stereotyping and prejudice. All that being said, I also want to right up the front acknowledge that I think we know a lot more about what not to do than we do about what works. So I often say in my 26 years of intervention, I have learned a lot about what does not work to reduce children's stereotypes and prejudices. I have learned a lot less about what does work. So there are going to be some big challenges, and I wanted to acknowledge that up front. But nonetheless, I do think we've learned some things that are useful to know for parents and educators as we go out to try and create a socially just world for the next generation. Okay, so figure out how to move forward. What we do know is, oops, there we go, is developmental science has told us that children do endorse stereotypes and prejudices about a whole bunch of types of attributes of people: race, ethnicity, weight, attractiveness, sexual orientation, physical disability, and gender, sex, are all examples of domains in which children endorse stereotypes and prejudices. And I'm going to focus today on gender, but I will probably say some things along the line about some of these other categories, because in many ways the processes are parallel. There are differences in the particulars, but a lot of the basic mechanisms for the formation of biases is the same across these categories. And I just want to say and be clear, when I talk about endorsing, for example, gender stereotypes, this is the kind of measure that we use. We say, for example, who can be a firefighter, who can play with dolls, who can show bravery. Only boys, only girls, or both boys and girls. So we are using the word stereotype to mean beliefs about the ways in which characteristics, roles, and traits align with gender, how they should be prescribed, right, by gender in the world. And when I use the word prejudice, I'm usually talking about the affective component, so your feelings towards people of your own group or the other group. And often we measure that by looking at who children like to play with. So tell me, how much do you like to play with this child? How much do you like to play with this child? And we'll show all of the peers in a classroom, for example. Or looking at the time they actually play with their peers of their own gender versus the other gender. And what we know, if you look at the literature on stereotyping and prejudice over the last 60 years, is that children endorse stereotypes about gender and show prejudice on the basis of gender by the time they are 2 to 3 years old. So this starts really early in development that you see evidence of these things. Very common. Now, I want to do a brief I want to briefly acknowledge something. I'm going to talk about intervention to reduce stereotyping and prejudice, but I want to acknowledge that values play a role in deciding whether you want to do anything to reduce stereotyping and prejudice. So in other words, my talk is going to be starting with the premise that stereotypes and prejudices constrain children in negative ways. And there's lots of evidence that's true, but my talk today is not on the negative consequences associated with gender stereotyping and prejudice. So I'm acknowledging that I'm assuming those things, but there are people in the world, and we maybe just had an election, so we realize there are more of them than we thought, that believe that gender stereotyping and gender prejudice are good things. So in other words, they argue that gender should constrain people's lives, often arguing that the two genders are different innately, biologically, they are hardwired for different traits and roles, and therefore forcing them to be more similar is a bad thing rather than a good thing. And so I just want to be clear that I have a certain set of values, and I believe they often are based in research, right? Evidence that the stereotypes and prejudices are constraining children in ways that are dysfunctional or not optimal. But I want to acknowledge there are people who don't have that view. Okay, so we got to do a first look at why do stereotypes and prejudices about gender or sex happen in the first place. In order to reduce them, I think it's useful to know something about why they're there in the first place. And that's going to give us some cues. So I'm going to do a real quick, here's the science of how you get to be a gender stereotyper in life. And so here's part one of the story. 2 big stages for becoming biased about gender. The first is children attend to others, gender or sex, and sort people into dichotomous categories or male and female. So the first step in the process for a child is to attend to gender, to be seeing the world through a lens of, I'm looking at, are you male or are you female? Male or female? I'm sorting people into these 2 categories. And then I'm going to approach the world with this idea of there's 2 types of people. And some of you are looking at me as if, of course, because this is what most people say, of course, right? That the world has 2 kinds of people, males and females, and everyone knows that, and we learn that very early. And so, in fact, you can ask how early, and what maybe we see this in babies, and the press loves these stories about babies who can do math and physics and all these wonderful things, and including even, these are baby races, that raises a possibility, and I show this because my own work is highlighted in this particular newsweek, which led to lots of people parodies and making fun of it. But the question has been raised, is your baby sexist, right? Does this originate in infants? And obviously, babies are not sexist, right? They do not endorse stereotypes and prejudices about gender. But babies do this. They attend to gender as a way to categorize people. So we now know between 3 and 6 months of age, babies are paying attention already, right, in this way of categorizing human faces into male or female. And it is not unique to gender. Babies do this with race between 3 and 6 months of age in methodologies that developmentalists have used to study babies. They show an awareness of, oh, white person, African-American person, right, male person, female person. But I want to be clear, they also do that with things like people who wear hats and people who don't wear hats, right? If you show a bunch of people in hats and a bunch of people not in hats, they notice, okay? So the principle is that babies come and they do categorize by gender very early, but they categorize on the basis of things they can see, basically. And gender in our world is something they can see. And to illustrate it, just have a quick illustration of this. If you showed this to young children, children anywhere from 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age, and said, sort these people into categories. Can you do a quick sort into 2 piles of these people? The majority of children will do this, right? Somewhere around 60 to 70% will just say, here are boys and here are girls. The remaining children will do it this way, and they'll say, here's the black people, and here's the white people. What children do not do is do it this way. I might do it this way, but I'm an adult. And that is because you cannot see political orientation. It isn't, right, not something that has an outside visible marker. Oh, maybe if you're in Texas it does. But in general it doesn't. And children do not attend to attributes of people they can't see. So having a physical marker for a trait like gender and race and weight and attractiveness make them risk factors for children in developing prejudice and stereotypes because they are bases of categorization for children. So step 1, you categorize into these 2 groups. And then, unfortunately, you get the next step, really inevitably, after categorization, which is once children have sorted individuals into their categories, they begin to associate these groups with particular traits and roles, right, attributes, and behaviors. That is, they're going to now learn the content of the stereotype. So I have 2 people, boys and girls, and now I'm going to figure out, what are girls like? What do they do? How do they look? What do they dress like? What do they prefer? And now I'm going to start to go over there and play with them. And say, no, I'm a girl, then I go on the girl side, and I should prefer girls and will prefer girls. But let me quickly run through this content of stereotypes that they build. We now know they build the content of their stereotypes in 3 ways. And we're talking, they're starting to do this when they're 2 years old. Between 2 and 3, and they've got the categories. 3 major ways. They're going to learn the group to attribute links, they're going to fabricate these links, and they're going to detect them. And let me just give you an example of each. We talk about learning links usually by explicit instruction. Often someone just straight up tells them what the group is like. So when someone says, boys don't cry, boys don't cry, the kid gets a clear explicit link that they learn. This is group, boys do this, or don't do this, and girls, they do this or don't do this. So explicit links. These are examples of links we have heard parents say in our studies, right? They just straight up say, boys don't cry, or Latinos like rice and beans. So they're just giving the content of the stereotype. Now, we don't think that gender and racial stereotypes are built so much in this way anymore, but they still continue to be built in this way, we know. And it might be that peers are especially likely to use this explicit link with each other. So that when peers talk to each other, they often will say things like, hey buddy, you have a pink backpack. That's not for boys. Only girls have pink backpacks, right? They just straight up tell you the link about the attribute and gender. But we also know, and this is really important, that kids fabricate links between traits and groups. So many people argue stereotypes are there and stereotypes are inevitable because they're based in reality, they have a kernel of truth. And that is not correct. Not all stereotypes have a basis in reality. They do not all have a kernel of truth at all. Some are fabricated links. And what we see happens in this case is that children, once objects or people are categorized, children infer these things must be all alike in some way because they're all in the same category. And there's a researcher at the University of Michigan, Susan Gellman, who is world famous for her research on this kind of thinking called essentialist thought. And children show rampant essentialist thought. And they say girls are in a category. It must be because girls have some deep, meaningful similarities, right, to put them in the same category. And this means kids make up things like, and one, this is heard, is black and white people have different kinds of blood. Okay, no one taught them that because it's not even true, right? And they make it up. And so kids will say things like, one of the examples I heard in my own life was one of my daughters spontaneously said, only boys like oysters. Girls don't like oysters, only boys like oysters. Well, she made that up because she didn't like oysters, right? And she's like, so I'm in this group, and so not all stereotypes have any kind of kernel of truth, but some do have a kernel of truth. Okay, so that third way is that kids learn stereotypes by looking around the world and correlating the attributes that go with particular gender groups or racial groups or any other group. So they are in some ways little scientists who go out and look around at the world and say what goes with being male or female. And I want to give you an example of this in politics. We wondered, this was in the year 2005, whether kids knew anything about the race and gender of the presidents of the United States. So in 2005, no one had heard of Barack Obama outside of his small circle in Chicago. We had never had anything but white male presidents. And we wondered, do kids know that? Have they developed a link between leadership and presidents, for example, and gender? And we couldn't find anything in the literature, so we just went out in a first exploratory study, and we asked kids these questions. Who should be president of the United States? Only boys, only girls, both boys and girls. Who really can be president in the United States? Only boys, only girls, or both boys and girls. And who usually is president of the United States? Only boys, only girls, or both boys and girls. All right, so we could establish something about their knowledge, and this is what we found. So this is kids' answers to who said only men are usually president of the United States. And you see ceiling performance from 8 to 11-year-olds. So by the time they were in 3rd grade, every kid in the United States that we tested knew that only boys are president of the United States. And impressive levels for kids in kindergarten through 1st grade of knowing this. So they were calculating. And now I sometimes laugh and I say, do you think any kindergarten teacher said, now look, boys and girls, what do we notice about the presidents? Right? No one is taught this, right? And especially in 2005, this was not a topic of conversation. So what children did was figure this out. Our next question was, how do you know that there's only been male presidents of the United States? And kids said the most wonderful thing. They said things like, there's a big poster at my school and they're all the presidents and they're all boys. The kid says, I have a ruler, I noticed, they're all boys. One kid pulled my sweater and said, have you seen the money? The money has the presidents, all boys. Right? So some evidence that they're correlating, right, the group and calculating statistical information about what goes. Now, interestingly, right, somewhat after 2005, the presidents looked like this, and I honestly didn't have the heart to make a picture of the next version of this. But an interesting question, and I mention this because I'm in the middle of doing this work right now. What will Hillary Clinton's candidacy for president do to kids' conceptions of that understanding leadership and its links to being female? And we're in the middle of doing a big study of the election. In 5 sites around the country, we've interviewed about 180 elementary school kids. We interviewed them 3 weeks before the election and 3 weeks afterwards, asking a lot of questions about gender because we thought the issues might revolve around gender. But the study became much more about race. Our kids talked a great deal about race and ethnicity and immigration in relation. But I want to mention one interesting thing. We asked kids at the pre-election study, again, who can be president, who should be, who usually is, has there ever been a female president? And I was expecting more kids to be knowledgeable. I was expecting ceiling levels of kids with Hillary Clinton's candidates saying, no, we would never, I know, we have never had a female president, and so we'll be at max level. They were not. We had surprisingly more kids say, oh yes, there's been other presidents of the United States who were women. And some of the kids explicitly said, yeah, Hillary's running, we've had women presidents like Hillary. And in the next step of the study, we show them the truth. We get out the picture of all the presidents and show so we can ask some more questions. And this was a moment I was not expecting. When 3 of the kids I interviewed, they happened to all be girls, who said, oh yes, like we have other girl presidents. And I have to say, well, actually, here's the picture of all the presidents. And the girls, their faces are like, oh, there's no girls? And they look at me, there's no girls? And I have to say, no, there's never been. Now, one girl points to John Adams. He looks like a girl. There's never and this theme is going to come up a little bit later about conversations and what we talk about and what we don't talk about with children. But I'm not entirely convinced that this last campaign will be good at all for children's conceptions of the link between gender and leadership. Okay. So I now want to move to, kind of how your kid gets to be biased. Let's move to what we can do to prevent and minimize. And I want to make a distinction between the two because they're very different kinds of strategies. One kind of strategy would be to prevent the formation ever of stereotyping and prejudice. And the other kind of strategy would be to remediate. So if you're a 4th grade teacher or a parent of a 4th grader, you're in the position at this point of needing to reduce stereotyping and prejudice because you're not going to eliminate it. It's already formed, according to most of the research. And they're going to be slightly different. And I'm going to start with focusing on prevention. So given what we know about how they form, a first step in prevention would be to block the routine attention and sorting of people by gender, sex. Right? So that first thing, I'm going to make 2 categories of the world, males and females. If you wanted to prevent stereotyping and prejudice, a first step perhaps would be to block that automatic sorting of the world into those 2 categories. Now, here's people's first instinct for how to do that. People's first instinct is to adopt what we would call a gender-blind ideology or strategy. And this is not studied in the case of gender very much, but is studied in the case of race. So what we know is, with what is called race-blind ideology, that white people in particular have massively adopted colorblind ideology as a way, as a strategy to minimize racial stereotyping and prejudice. Now, some colorblind ideology folks have a different goal, right? So I want to acknowledge everyone who endorses a colorblind ideology does not have the same motivation, but some of them have a motivation that is intentionally and honestly aimed at reducing stereotyping and prejudice. Who say, for example, I want my kid not to pay attention to people's color, to not think that their race is important. I want them to love everybody and not notice. And so I'm never going to talk about race. I'm going to act like I don't see it with the hope that then my child will not see it. So what have we learned about these colorblind strategies? We've learned they do not work. And I did a study in 2012 of colorblind ideology parents, white parents and their 4- and 5-year-old children, and I don't have time to tell you the details, but I can tell you it absolutely did not work. Our white, pretty well-educated, middle-class mothers massively adopted the strategy of saying, I don't talk about race with my kid, that's my strategy for having them not notice race and not care about it themselves. And we knew when we looked at their child's racial attitudes that that failed miserably, okay? So, the message here is that gender-blind ideology will not work. And that is because the child is already being raised in a situation, right, in a context, in an environment that is going to make them attend to gender, sort people by gender, and build traits. So just if you as the parent or you as the teacher personally decide to never mention race or gender in your classroom, That will not stop the process, because the older cultural messages are too pervasive and too strong and too common to have that alone block the development of gender categorization and stereotyping and prejudice. And I just wanted to give you this example because it's so cute in the case of race. This is an example of what a colorblind lesson for children looks like with a scholastic book that celebrates Martin Luther King Day. And here it says, he helped people work together peacefully, he helped people play together peacefully, he helped people eat together peacefully, he helped people go to school together peacefully. We celebrate his birthday every year. Got it. So colorblind with the idea that here's this wonderful bright guy and he's black and we're going to assume you're going to see here's an African American person who did the great thing, but we're not going to talk about race at all. And we know this absolutely doesn't work. Now here is somewhat of an irony about this. In the case of Martin Luther King, we know from our research and other researchers that almost every child in America knows who Martin Luther King is. In our study, the study we did of this election, we asked, do you know who Martin Luther King is? Every kid says yes. He fought for black people's rights. He thought hating people because they were black was wrong. We next asked, can you name someone who did those same things for women's rights? Can you name someone like Martin Luther King who fought for women's rights? We have yet to have one kid in the 69 that we tested in Austin to be able to name a single person. They know of no one like that. So this is a colorblind version aimed at younger kids. But because we have MLK Day in the United States, most schools have lessons about Martin Luther King that are ultimately not colorblind. Mostly they do address the fact that he was fighting racial stereotyping and prejudice and talk about what that means. So you're not going to do that, but people really do have this gender blind. They don't talk very much about gender stereotyping and prejudice, though they do talk a lot about gender. So avoiding it's not going to work. So in terms of prevention, what we can say is that avoiding the routine, unexplained use of gender to label and sort people is important. So I'm going to argue that labeling people is bad. So, for example, saying, good morning, boys and girls. Girls line up. What a nice girl. What a good boy. What a cute, right? What does your son like to do? Why is your daughter, right, doing this today? Labeling gender causes attention to it and plays a major role in that first step in paying attention to gender and sorting by gender. In fact, I would argue that the verbal labeling of gender in English is the single most powerful predictor of children's sorting and attention to gender. It would be like kids went to school and every day we said, okay, good morning, whites and Latinos. Let's have the Latinos get their pencil. What a good job for a white child. What a nice white child you are. All right, imagine we lived in that world, what you would see in terms of level of race. And that's what you get with gender. We get this constant, good morning, boys and girls, what a good girl. We'll say boy, girl, boy, girl. So what I'm going to argue is one of the first steps and first practical tips is to reduce your labeling of gender when it is not necessary and not relevant to the situation. So instead of saying, good morning, boys and girls, and saying to your partner, can you get our daughter at school today, right? Or what a nice son you have, to use gender-neutral language. So to say, good morning, students. Mary, you can get your backpack. Let's have people who have an orange shirt on today line up at the door first, right? It is when you mark these things with language that you get the beginnings of the sorting. It has also led me to adopt gender-neutral language. So this is the more controversial, more crazy solution to the problem. But I believe that English is going to be problematic because it is virtually impossible to talk about anyone in English without labeling their gender because of our pronouns. Some languages have no gender pronouns, like Hungarian. You can talk about people and never label their gender. But in English, you, of course, can't, and in some other languages, it's worse. You can't talk about tables and chairs without labeling gender. But one proposed solution is gender-neutral pronouns. I have become an advocate, and this is for myself. I now, on my website, I have asked people in my life and community to refer to me as Z. I usually say, you can talk about me, and when you talk about my back behind me, When you talk about me behind my back, I hope you use the in here. This comes out of this belief that we are going to have to change our language if we are going to reduce children's tendency to sort people into gender categories as these big primary identifications. Right? I really think it's totally possible, and kids could do see and hear very easily. So that's one kind of recommendation. But also, related to that sorting, I already told you kids pay attention to what they can see. And you might think it is inevitable to see gender, that gender is so naturally, perceptually salient. This turns out not to be true. Research has shown that children cannot pick out other children's gender from their faces at all without cues. And in fact, adults often have a great deal of trouble picking out children's gender without cues. Now, of course, when you gender babies like this with cues, and the culture works very hard to do that. Our culture, for example, uses dress, right? For decades, we mandated that men wear different clothing than women, even in the same workspace, in order so we could quickly and easily differentiate the genders. Right now, the American Civil Liberties Union is suing a lawsuit, suing a public school in the U.S. in the lawsuit for demanding that girls wear skirts in school as their uniform and boys wear pants. So we even haven't totally eliminated that kind of marker. And this is just to show you how wildly much harder it is to identify people's gender without those cues. So in the top, you can identify who's a female and a male even when their heads are cut off, right? You just have to see their knees to know who's male and female. In the bottom picture, much harder to discriminate male and female when people have the same hairdo and are dressed the same way. So the other argument, which I would like to make, is that it would help reduce children's tendency to sort people if they didn't have such readily available obvious cues. And I'm not arguing that we have to get rid of all dress or accessories or items that are associated with gender, only that we can't have such firm rules, so that we should allow boys to wear berets. When boys say, and they do, I don't know a boy at some point in our studies who didn't want to paint their nails or have a bracelet or wear a beret because they're super cool. And what we have to do is simply allow more boys to adopt those things. That reduces the perceptual salience of gender and will lessen children's tendency to see the world in those two obvious ways. Okay, so the next part of prevention, right, is like I said, you've got to reduce kids' tendency to see the world. There's two groups of people here. There's males and females. I got them in my two dichotomous categories. But would be then to stop this linking of other characteristics to that group, right? That part two group, or part two stage of building the stereotype. So even if a kid did sort, like, oops, we screwed up, they said here's men and here's women, the next thing we could prevent is them tying traits and roles and attributes to gender. Right? And many people have argued this. This isn't my idea. Sandra Bem, for example, has said what we need to do is strip gender of all the attributes except, for example, genitalia. And so to say to kids, here's what a boy is. A boy has a penis. And here's what a girl has a vagina. That's all. A vagina. That's all we know. That's all there is. It doesn't go with anything else. It doesn't go with any occupations. It doesn't go with any traits, etc. Now, I'm not advocating that as a solution because there's some problems with that as well, including the simple fact that not all boys have a penis and not all girls have a vagina, so we've already got a problem. And in fact, when pushed to say what gender is, if you were going to strip it down to a 3-year-old and say, here's what a girl is, what is it? We don't know, right? Even scientists have no answer, right? The sports federations of America are going crazy because they want to try to see who's a male and who's a female because a lot of money and glory is at stake, and they can't figure out what you could strip it down to in a way that's clear. So we don't have an answer, and that's going to be hard, right? When we talk about conversations with kids, even adults don't have an answer. But certainly it makes sense to limit the content of stereotyping by limiting the links that they draw to when they're talking about gender. So how can you do that? One simple way is to make sure you're exposing children to equal numbers of males and females doing all the different things. So of individuals who have long and short hair, you would want them to see men and women with long and short hair. I just Googled some pictures of firefighters and police officers, right? If children learned what a police officer was and then saw equal numbers of males and females being police officers, they would be unable to draw a link, for example, that only men are police officers, or only men should be police officers. So you would want to have this random distribution. And now I'm going to talk about how hard that is to actually achieve, in part because when I Google searched women police officers and women firefighters, this is what I did, right? I was like, oh my gosh, that's what comes up when I Google women police officers. We don't want to do that, so I'm going to go off of that quick. So, now maybe you're already thinking of this problem with the counter-stereotypic models. The problem is that you are never going to be able to outweigh in your classroom or your home the number of stereotypic models kids see. Right? So we know from research, when I started doing my interventions in the 1980s, people were saying that intervention doesn't work. Reading books, for example, about a female firefighter won't work. Reading books about a strong, smart African American won't work to counteract the stereotypes of those groups. And I didn't believe it. I said, how could that not make a difference if I read this book about a female firefighter? But what we now know, and I know from now some of my own studies, is that it doesn't work. And there are probably two big reasons it doesn't work, two big contributors to the fact that reading and presenting counter-stereotypic models won't work to counteract the big stereotype in most people, in children. And one is because children actually distort and forget the models that don't fit their expectations. So you're going to see, or when we get to the talk about minimizing stereotyping, how minimizing is going to be difficult because children are now going to operate with a strong bias to confirm their beliefs. And all humans do this, so adults do this as well, but children have a particularly strong tendency to distort information to fit what they already think. So in my first study, we went out and we read books about female firefighters and male librarians and female police officers and male nurses. And right after the book, a long story with a nice plot, we would sit down the kid and say, tell me what happened in the book and what did the character do? And the firefighter came. And what did the firefighter do? And what the children did is distort the counter-stereotypic versions of the story and say, he came in and he put out the fire and he saved the puppy. Even though I just read them a story about a female firefighter, and said she came in the house and she sprayed her hose and she saved the puppy and she got in her fire truck and she waved her butt. And the kid sat down and said, he came in the house and he saved the puppy. Okay? So we now know that children strongly distort. So counter-stereotypical models alone are not going to be enough. But you're going to see they might prevent the original formation, right? If you could prevent the kid from ever thinking men are firefighters in the first place, you might be more effective. But the other problem is, of course, that they're outnumbered by the stereotypic, right, persons in the world. So I can say, here's a female firefighter, but the kid will see the world, which does indeed have way more male firefighters than female firefighters. So the genders are not equally distributed, of course, across hobbies and activities and interests and jobs. And so much of the real world is going to confirm rather than disconfirm children's budding stereotypes, right? Their stereotypes are going to be based on this world. And I can tell you what happens as a parent when you do this is you get into this kind of fight. We drive by with my 4-year-old son Holden, we see a female driving a bulldozer. And I'm like, oh look, a female bulldozer driver. Women can drive bulldozers. No, they can't, Mom. Yes, they can. Look, she's driving the bulldozer. She's probably going to crash the bulldozer, Mom. No, you sexist pig. Look at that. Driving the bulldozer. No, Mom. Almost no girls drive bulldozers. Boys drive bulldozers. He's like, I know the world, Mom. You have a crazy, right, misperceived, right? It just became you have the warped idea of the world that's wrong. I know the world. I've seen bulldozer drivers, and he had, right, in countless books and movies and billboards and experience that confirmed it. So the problem at the moment now is that the culture needs to change. In order to reduce the tendency, right, to use gender to label people and to segregate, to do things that make gender salient categories for children, because the situation now is that almost all children will come to sort people into those gender categories because of language, because of the elaborate cues with accessories and haircuts and clothes that we use to make sure everyone can tell who's male and who's female. We are not going to have children that grow up and say, I don't really pay attention to gender, right? It's not a big deal to me. So the culture needs to change, and that means you need to be a part of cultural change. So in addition to your families and your classrooms, I am asking all of you to be a part of a wider societal effort, which it's going to take, right? Or in some ways we're going to be spinning our wheels on the prevention. We're not getting very far in totally preventing children's attention to gender. And that means most of the time, without the societal change, we're working on merely reducing. We're working on remediation of gender stereotyping instead of prevention. So I want to get to that side of things. Okay, remediation is difficult. Once a kid has a biased attitude about race or gender, it is very hard to get rid of. I just pulled up some quotes to show you this is not me. This is 50 years of researchers saying how hard this is. Williams and Moreland from 1976 said attitude modification via classroom curriculum procedures is at best very difficult to accomplish. These are interventions related to kids' attitudes about social groups, immigrants, race, and sometimes gender is in these studies. Here's from 78. Much of the intervention effort has accomplished little, with those who have completed the experimental programs often not differing in ethnocentrism from those not exposed to programs. One more, Banks' curriculum interventions can help students develop more positive racial attitudes, but the effects of such interventions are likely not to be consistent. The conflicting findings from the careful studies attest to the difficulties of curriculum-based intervention. I'll just show you one more. They all conclude the same thing. What we've learned from all of the people who do interventions and then look at them for attitudes for all kinds of social groups is that it is extremely difficult to do this with the curriculum programs that are in place that we have carefully evaluated. And again, we can think through the reasons for this difficulty, but let me just give you a couple other conclusions from the really big literature. And the couple big conclusions is the programs are more effective when the stereotypes aren't very bad to begin with, which is not what you want, right? What the literature shows, yes, if the kids didn't come in very prejudiced, oh, then it's easier to fix their attitudes. The more biased the kids are when they start, the less effective our programs are in addressing them. Oh. Here I am. Second finding. Go forward. No, too far. They work better at immediate than longer time post-testing. So if you do your intervention and then test immediately after, like, okay, now what do you think of girls? All right, or now do you think girls can be firefighters? You are more likely to see effects if you wait 2 weeks later, and then you are almost highly unlikely to see effects if you wait 3 months later, okay? So that's also a depressing finding in that we want the things we do to have lasting effects. And lastly, you see higher effects in published studies than unpublished studies. That is, in the intervention literature, there is clearly an a publication bias. So if I do a study to reduce gender stereotyping and it works, it is much more likely to get published than if it doesn't work, and the field is full of interventions that don't work because of how difficult they are. And lastly, I will just add my own, which is that because I've done 26 years of intervention research and I have published maybe 9, 10 intervention studies that have worked, in every one of those cases where the intervention worked, what it did was produce a statistically significant, which means a reliable reduction in prejudice. Not a meaningful one, not a big one, not one that anybody should care about, technically. And just to give you an example, in our measure when we ask, who could be a firefighter? Only men, only women, both. Who can be a nurse? Who can be a librarian? We'll ask 25 jobs. And a kid gets a point every time they say both. for being, oh, that's good, that's egalitarian. You think both can be firefighters and garbage collectors and presidents of the United States. On average, for my effective intervention, I reduce the number of times kids give a stereotype or increase the number of times they say both about 4 out of 25 times. Okay? I make them say both 4 more times from the other kids, and it roughly gets them to about half. So a good egalitarian kid is a kid who says only men can do this, only women can do that, half of the time, 12 out of 25 roughly. And egalitarian answers the other time, and that's a successful intervention. Right? That is not an intervention I want the taxpayers to pay for, right? That is not an intervention that is going to solve the kinds of issues that I want to solve by merely pushing them a couple of degrees. So the intervention literature has a lot of problems with it. People do see, though, this glass is half full or half empty. Sometimes when I talk about intervention and say they're not effective, I piss people off. And it is a case that they're not meaningless and they're not without purpose. They do something, and there are interesting value questions. If you make 4 kids out of 20 more egalitarian, was it worth it or not? That's a value-laden question that is very hard to answer, right? So I want to be clear that there are 2 different ways to see this, but in the end, this is also very true. It doesn't matter if the glass is half empty or there's clearly room for more wine. I want to say there is clearly more room for intervention effects, right? There's clearly, we could be doing a better job. So, and here I just want to show you, here are a couple of the kinds of interventions that I have done. Most recently, I've written about the possibility of reading, writing, arithmetic, and racism, whether we should build into the curriculum more efforts to address these things. And now, in the time I have left, I want to talk some more specifically about the kinds of curriculum programs that seem most effective and the kinds of things that parents can say and do that seem, from our research efforts, the most useful. And one of the first messages is we need explicit discussion of gender and what it means and what it doesn't mean. So in other words, not gender blind and not routine use. To never say, oh, you need that, go ask that lady over there. You should never label her gender, right, if there's no purpose. But you need to talk to children about men and women, right, ladies and gentlemen, because we need to explain to them what gender means and what it doesn't mean. Okay, so we're going to have conversations. And in terms of lessons are more effective when they are highly explicit in their content versus subtle or relying on children to make inferences. So let me go back to that firefighter example. You could read a book in which a little boy gets a puppy and his house catches on fire. The firefighter comes and the firefighter is a woman and she sprays it and puts out the house. Now, what are you relying on the child to do? You're relying on the child to do something like this. Oh, look, it's a woman who came. I didn't know a woman could be a firefighter. Oh my gosh, I have to revise my whole attitude about firefighting because look, there's a woman. Darn it, men and women must both be able to be firefighters. Let me change my attitude now. Okay, doesn't happen, right? Too much work for the 6-year-old brain to do. A very different kind of approach. So our first lessons that we developed, we went in and we said to the kids, I'm going to teach you the rules about who can be a firefighter. There's rules, and I'm going to teach you 2 of them, and you have to know these 2 rules about who can be a firefighter. And then they tried to practice a rule. Rule 1 was firefighters must like to fight fires. Okay, simple rule, don't like to fight fires, you cannot be a firefighter. Right? Simple rule, practice it. Second rule, you have to learn to drive a fire truck. Right? So we made it simple. You got to learn to drive a fire truck. Big truck, it's big, it's hard. If you can drive it to get to the fire that you'd like to put out, you can be a firefighter. And then we said, okay, listen carefully. Let's practice. Here's Bob. Bob hates fires. He's afraid of fires. Bob does not know how to drive his fire truck. Could Bob be a firefighter? No. Right? They all have to yell no. And then we say, why? And they have to say, he doesn't follow the rules. Then we say, here's Anne. Anne loves to fight fires. Anne likes fires. She likes to see them. She's not afraid of them. She likes to fight them. Anne knows how to drive a fire truck. She's a very good fire truck driver. Could Anne be a firefighter? And all the kids have to yell, yes. Right? And then we have to say, why? Because she follows the rules. And inevitably, this was the second part of the lesson, we had some kid yell, no, Anne can't be a firefighter. She's a girl. And then we said, oh, You're right, we have to talk about that. Is there a rule that only boys can be firefighters? Did we learn that rule? Did we hear that rule? No, boys and girls. There is no rule, right? Say boys and girls. No. There is no rule like that. I know, it's so easy to slip. There is no rule that says that only boys. And then you say, gender is irrelevant. Gender has nothing to do with this. Gender doesn't have anything to do with liking fire or know how to direct fire truck. And they have to practice. And I can tell you, I amazingly had a kid, in doing a lesson, we said, could Ann be a firefighter? And the kid yells out, yes, because he follows the rules. This is that active distortion, right? It was easier for that kid to make Ann a man than to accept Ann a woman as a firefighter. It's like, yeah, he follows the rules. So, you need to be highly explicit. So when you're talking about race and gender, doing the subtle thing, I'll put up a picture of Jackie Robinson and just hope they get the idea that I like black people, will not do it. And this is the most controversial. You might actually have to tell kids, I really like black people, right? Or I really think that women are great engineers. Or I really think men make great babysitters for children. I think men are nurturing and warm. If you want kids to think those things, you are going to have to tell them explicitly, okay? So lessons and discussions are better if they're highly explicit. And I just had a couple of lessons about this schematic processing because it's really well established and disturbing and points to that need for being explicit and checking. Lynn Libben, who I worked with in graduate school, did these wonderful studies where she showed kids pictures of men and women doing traditional and non-traditional things. And then there was just a surprise memory test where she said, okay, tell me all the pictures you saw. And what kids did was remember many more stereotypic ones, even though there were equal numbers of counter-stereotypic ones, and they distorted them to fit. They said in response to this, some kids said, I saw a man and he was fixing the typewriter. Right? And they said, I saw a woman who was a secretary typing. So even when you show the same thing, they will distort it unless you are very careful to say, she's an engineer, right? She is fixing this, or she is designing this. You have to make sure, and then check that they have encoded it in the way you want. And I'm just going to skip the graph there. The other part has to do with active versus passive learning. We have learned from our interventions that making kids active in the learning is far more effective than being passive. And I'll give you an example. So we have been, in one of our studies, teaching children to respond to bias. So we wanted to go into, we did this study where we ambitiously tried to teach kids in kindergarten through 4th grade to identify 6 kinds of sexism. We actually went in and we said, we're having sexism lessons. We're going to learn the first word, sexism. Anybody know what sexism means, right? None of them did. And then we defined the concept and introduced 6 kinds, and then we're going to practice detecting it. So one kind was gender-based exclusion, for example. So we said, if you ever say that someone can't play or do an activity because of their gender, because they're a boy or a girl, that is sexism, okay? That's our first kind of sexism. Let's practice. If you go on the playground and Billy says, can I play? And the girls say, no, it's the girls' day to have the swings. What is that? And they all yell, that's sexism! And you're like, yes, you recognize, right? The first form. And then we taught them retorts. So we wanted to get them to have an active response. It's not enough just to recognize it. We wanted them to be able to confront and challenge. So because they're little, we taught them rhyming things. So one of the responses, and there's 6 different rhymes for each kind of sexism. The first one, for the exclusion, is they have to yell, you can't say girls can't play. Or you can't say boys can't play. So they learn a retort. The other kinds of sexism for like the backpack, if they said that's a girl's backpack, they would have to yell, I disagree, sexism is silly to me. And we are very intentionally using the word silly instead of wrong or bad or dumb to just kind of get this silly, puzzling idea to us that we don't think is appropriate in this school. So they would learn to yell that retort. Now here's the critical thing. We compared 2 kinds of lessons. In one, we read books in which a child used the retort. So we just read a book. A kid said, you can't play here, it's the boys' day for the sandbox. And the kid said, you can't say boys can't play. And it was successful, and they went on. In the other condition, we made the kids put on skits. We gave them props, And then we made them write their own play, and they had to write a skit in which the sexism was represented. You had to do the kind of sexism. We're like, get it right, don't goof up the kind of sexism. Make sure it's like exclusion and not trait-based stereotyping. And then one of the kids had to have the role of using the retort, right? So now you have to be the one, and you have to get out the retort and use it. What we found is that the stories lessons were totally ineffective. They totally do not work. Partly because the kids remembered everything else about the story except what we intended, right? They didn't notice the retort or decide that that was the effective part of the lesson. The kids who actively used them, we had a much higher success rate, and we measured this in a couple of ways in hypothetical stories, but here was my favorite part, and it's going to illustrate 2 points. What we did is use hidden observers. We had, for the kids in the study, a kid, a Confederate, a child in their class. We picked one kid to be a Confederate who was their own peer, and they came up to a kid and said a sexist comment. And specifically, an adult came up to a kid and said, this woman left her purse. This was a boy. A woman left her purse down here in the hall. Could you return it to the office for us so she can pick it up there? And the kid had to go down the hall to the office of the school. And the peer confronted them at a corner where we could hide and said, ooh, you have a purse. Purses are for girls. And now we are going to record whether they actually use the statement that they've been taught to use. So I loved it as a dependent variable for the study. So what we found is that the kids in the control lesson, they never confronted the sexism in the statement. In fact, the modal answer was, yeah, I know, right? The kids walking down with the hall of the purse. You have a purse, and they're like, yeah, I know. And they're right, they have such bad perspective taking skills, they don't even explain why they have the purse. I figured they would have a big rationale, and they're just like, no, man, I know, it's for girls. So kids and their cognitive limitations. What we had in the experimental group was, again, a statistically significant, a reliable increase. So we had more kids in that intervention condition who did indeed confront the peer, and I didn't look up the exact number again, and I don't think I have a slide of it, but the answer is it's still it's still a pretty low, depressing number of respondents. So I'm guessing it was something like 14 out of our maybe 40 kids. Yeah, so you're like, right, okay, I got 14 kids to say, I disagree. And they would say something like, I disagree. Sexism, oh, girls can, anybody can do this. Right? They would mix up their sexism. So it wasn't perfect, but they were contesting the issues. But still, we had many kids who didn't, right? So it is very hard to get kids. And so one message here again is that the lessons have to be explicit. You have to help them actively develop strategies for detecting and confronting, right? They're going to have to be able to do both. So they need practice and you explicit help with detecting the problems, and then the lessons need to be active instead of just watch this and learn this from this. So those are big kinds of lessons. And here's my last point. How am I doing for time? You want me to finish up here quick? Has to do with emotional reactions to lessons. And I'll just tell you, what we did is we wanted to see what happens when kids are actually taught about racism and sexism. Okay, so part of being explicit is this. I'm going to teach you about what gender and race means. And given I don't know what it means to be female, I don't have a definition, but here's what I know all women have in common. The experience of being stigmatized by gender, the experience of stereotyping and prejudice based on their gender. That's what all women have in common. So when I talk to kids about gender, my inclination is to talk to them about what gender means and doesn't mean in the context of a conversation about stereotyping and prejudice. But at first, we didn't know very much about how children would understand, and respond to lessons about stereotyping and prejudice, about discrimination. And I do want to highlight there's some potential really negative consequences, right? If you go in and teach people, for example, about sexism, you risk, for example, that girls might feel permanently victimized. They might feel powerless, right? They might also be really angry, right? You might get, right, the fear, right, of men hating women, right, if we get so angry about sexism. So there are some potential problems. You also might fear on the privileged group side, they might feel defensive. They might not want to hear those lessons, right? This is unfair. I'm getting angry to hear about my role in sexism or racism. So you might get negative responses in terms of those things. So the first thing we wanted to do in a study that was published in Child Development with my student Julie Moten Hughes, we just compared pretty tightly controlled lessons about famous historical figures, and this is Jackie Robinson. One lesson that just read about him and showed his picture and never said anything about his race, so it was a colorblind or discrimination. And then we built in some that mentioned his race. So this has race-based labeling. Instead of just, here's Jackie Robinson, please notice that he's black. We said he was African American, and we say he lived in a mostly white neighborhood, and we say he played for an all African American baseball team. But what you notice is missing is any talk of discrimination, right, of experiences with prejudice. And then we control the same lesson where all we've done now is build in some statements about the negative experience. So his white neighbors teased him because he was African American. He was banned from the major leagues back because back then they were racist and they didn't let any African Americans play on a major league no matter how good they were. So we do these three kinds of lessons. We take pre and post test of kids' racial attitudes before and after, and look at the consequences, and we also assess some emotional reactions to the lesson. And just to give you an example, did today's lesson make you feel bad about being white? Was today's lesson unfair because it made white people look meaner than they really are? We have now done this same set of lessons with gender. So we did the parallel. I don't have slides, but we did lessons on famous historical figures, some of which were women, and now we sometimes included the women's experiences with discrimination on the basis of gender or left them out. And now we look at the consequences of the lesson. And here's the take-home message. The lessons are more effective when they talk about stereotyping and discrimination than when they don't. But they also induce low levels of negative affect. Right? So if you compare these lessons that mention stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination and those that don't, you get higher levels of saying today's lesson made me angry, or today's lesson made me defensive, or today's lesson made me upset in this way, or worry that I might be victimized. But importantly, those levels are low. They are higher than the baseline where you never say it, but they are low enough that I feel comfortable in strongly recommending that we confront these issues with children. And also, when you look at the positive emotional reactions, and my favorite one is, this lesson made me more interested in fighting for social justice. This lesson made me more interested in my life in working to stop prejudice and discrimination. Different wordings of those questions, those are all higher in the discrimination and prejudice conditions. So children are motivated by a very strong sense of fairness. Children want fairness, and I can tell you from our interviews about Donald Trump, we heard over and over and over again, he is mean, he yells at people, he insults people, and that's wrong. Kids are told every day, you don't yell at people, you don't call them names, you use your words, you be polite, right? You calmly explain. They told us he is everything we are told not to do, right? And so children have this strong sense of what's fair, and treating people fairly is important to them. So if you can bring these discussions about gender and race and other social categories and what they mean and how they connect to fairness, that will really resonate with kids all the way down to age 3 and 4. So we are recommending that you gently introduce these topics. And here's what I'm admitting I don't know. You might ask, what exact kinds of instances of discrimination and prejudice can we discuss? And we don't know the borders. So in our lessons, we all started with picking examples of prejudice and discrimination, one that were old and not current. Okay? We did not discuss current sexism or racism. We talked about old days, which felt safer to us, right? And I don't know, because we haven't done the study yet about how kids will respond to present day, right? This is happening to women and Muslims and African Americans and Latinos right now. I don't know the parameters. And also, it's mild. We talked about exclusion, and teasing, right, being prevented from doing things. We did not talk about lynching. We did not talk about concentration camps, right? We did not talk about really negative consequences of gender and race. And also importantly, we talked about stories that have positive outcomes. So I'm the first person to say, we talked about Jackie Robinson because he was successful. We did not talk about the African American who died poor in obscurity because they were never allowed to do the thing they should have been done, right? It had this uplifting American dream kind of context to it, and so did the gender ones, right? We're talking about Sandra Day O'Connor, and woo-woo, she's on the Supreme Court, it had a good outcome. We did not talk about the women who never made it. And my big belief is that we need to tell children that full range of stories. We need to tell them the horrible and the deeply depressing along with the uplifting. And yet I can't stand up here and say we know what the consequences will be or what is the best way to do or what age you can start to do it. So right now my recommendation is you feel it out in conversations with kids gently. And kids can give you messages about what seems okay to them and what they seem to be like, I can't talk about that, I can't face that, I don't want to hear about that right now. And that for now we try to be sensitive to that pressure, but at the same time, what I say about this is what I say about exercise, no pain, no gain. If you had a conversation about race, or stereotyping or prejudice, or gender stereotyping or prejudice, or attractiveness stereotyping or prejudice, and it didn't make you upset or uncomfortable, to some degree, it wasn't a good enough conversation, right? We might just have to say to children, some of the conversations that we have in classrooms and in our family are tough and hard and might make us sad, but they're going to have these good consequences, and so we have to have them and learn to cope with the ways that make us feel defensive or angry. I will end with that and hope to answer some questions about it.
Dr. Bigler. And so I want to say, first of all, if there's more food, please go have some. But also I want to invite questions. And I'd like to make sure we have questions for the non-academic parents and the non-university parents and teachers who came. I know it's a night event. Some of you have kids at home too. So I really appreciate you coming out, and I want to make sure you have a chance to ask your questions.
Yes, how old were the children in that study about?
Elementary, so we're doing kindergartners through about 4th grade, and that's true of most of the interventions we've done. We've gone up to middle school, but I do think you can teach even pretty young elementary school kids about what racism and sexism mean, and give them some practical examples and some ways to detect it, and they are really readily appalled by examples. I will say we have also studied whether you can do a blind treat people nicely, a broad, I should say, treat people nicely lesson. So in our most recent study, we compared just, you shouldn't tease people, you should always be nice, you shouldn't exclude anyone, and not mention race or gender. And we looked whether that would be sufficient, because we're also seeing a kind of gender blind, race blind bullying lessons, right? They go into schools and just say, you need to be nice to everyone, you need to use your words and be kind all the time. And we looked to see whether that would be enough to blunt kids stereotyping about race and gender, and they're not. We compared explicitly in our last study with gender, doesn't work at all. And what we think happens is that kids see their remarks about gender very differently. So when a kid comes over and says, you know, pink is for girls, you can't have that backpack, like you need to get rid of that, that's a girl's color. The kid doesn't think I'm bullying. They're saying, I know I'm supposed to be nice. I'm being nice and giving you a little tip that you're really being socially inappropriate here, and I think you should know. So the kids would say, these things are perfectly nice to say to kids, right? You shouldn't have that haircut, you shouldn't buy those shoes, you need to be the nurse and not the doctor, because I'm just giving you a tip about the real world that will be helpful to you. Don't butt your head against the wall trying to be a nurse, honey, right? Or doctor, they're nurses, and so they don't see it as bullying and antisocial. So again, that being explicit is important, and I do think you can do it with kids that are pretty young. And all of these lessons were Teaching Tolerance. The organization funded us to do some of this. They have all of the lessons, they publish them, And they are on the sites of some of the state's Board of Education websites for suggestions for reducing sexism in classes.
And can people get to that from your website?
Yes, I think you can get to the teaching, tolerance, and I'll go back and check to make sure. Yes, because they're wonderful and fun to do. Yeah.
The emotional reactions for the Jackie Robinson story specifically, I was wondering if there were any open-ended questions that were asked afterwards. Because these here are kind of leading, and so I was wondering if there were any open-ended questions.
Yes.
Were there any reactions like, it made me feel bad, or was it only the ones that responded to these?
Yeah, and there's about 6 of these we did ask open. The first question was, how did today's lesson make you feel?
Okay.
And the average answer we get is like, oh.
That's what I was
Yeah. So we scrapped them. We're like, that's not useful. We're going to have to prod. So we asked about the ultimate way. We asked different questions for the white and African American kids. So we did 2 studies with these lessons, one with just white kids and one in an African American setting school. And so, for example, with the white kids, we asked about guilt and defensiveness. With the African American kids, we asked about hopelessness and anger, right? Does it make you angry at white people for? And then asked about some positive outcomes like commitment to civil rights activities in both. So you see different reactions than we do, right? So it's some of the African American kids are pretty pissed when they learn this stuff. And some of our white kids are defensive. And we do ask about overall liking lessons, and I will say, for example, in gender, there's a big gender difference. The girls like our lessons about sexism more than boys do. So we ask, how much did you enjoy the lesson? And girls say, I love this. I was so happy to learn about Sandra Day O'Connor and the stuff she overcame. And the boys are like, yeah, not so much. I don't know what part of it is boys don't like to learn about women, because we know that's true. They're less likely to want to read a book about a female, learn about a female, watch a show with a female. And so part of that is we're embedding this content with females. And I think some of the work we have to do is get the groups to care about not their own issues. And so one of the things I also will say I'm upset about is things like single-sex schooling, where the solution is to separate the genders and say, okay, we'll have girls in this school and they'll read about feminism and they'll read about great women heroines, and then over here in the men's school they'll read about boys, and that is going to undermine that very issue with boys needing to care about women and their lives and social justice. And I always say, who needs to understand sexism more, boys or girls? Okay, why are we making a girl empowerment school? I think we need a girl empowerment school that only has boys in it. Right? That's what would be useful. So we need integration and we need conversation with kids together in these rooms, ideally, so that the kids can hear each other's reactions. So I think it's important that African American kids see white guilt, right, and white defensiveness both. And white kids see African American anger and hopelessness. Same thing with gender, right? We need to cope and learn about each other's reactions to these things to come up with better solutions to work together. So this tendency to segregate our schools, right? More racially segregated in the U.S. than they have been since 1955, right? And the gender segregation that they're now doing in public schools will not promote these kinds of lessons or conversations.
Briefly, Becky, I just wanted to say, sometimes, like as a parent of 2 young kids, sometimes my friends who are parents of girls would be like, I want to read them the books about engineers, women being able to be engineers. But it's just, what you're saying is just as important for parents of boy children to be reading those books.
Absolutely.
So that the boys understand girls can be engineers as well. And I feel like sometimes that's lost on people.
Right. And here's what I like about having all the kids challenge the sexism. It shouldn't be on the victim to defend themselves, right? It should be on the bystanders. And so that when, for example, a girl is told, you can't do that, you can't play with it, I want her male peers to be just as likely to stand up and say she can do that, right? That has got to be the ultimate solution. So, which is why I like lessons that target everybody and talk about having bystanders understand sexism, detect it, and then confront it. So we're not just having these victims who have to defend themselves.
Hi, I am a parent of an almost 4-year-old, and I find myself, I see him doing a lot of the first stage of what you talked about with the sorting, with both race and gender, but I have not actually yet seen him do a whole lot of the linking the stereotypes. And so as a parent, I find myself wondering how much to suggest stereotypes. And I mean, obviously he's going to learn eventually, but I worry about being too suggestive in what he might think girls can and can't do, or that might be the differences between black people and white people, and where to go with that?
Yeah, my advice is to just ask questions, have conversations. But the stage, it's a very common around 2 and 3 kids will start to say to their parents, is that a boy or girl? Is that a boy or girl? Right? The categorization, you can see that it's becoming a thing because they're going, is that a boy or girl? Is that a boy or girl? And to which I think a good answer is, I don't know, and why do we care? Do you care whether it's a boy? I don't really care whether it's a boy or girl. Why are you, right, asking? So you're going to convey your values, and when you say, I don't know, let's look, okay, they have long hair, you girls have long hair, I think it'll be a girl. You're conveying a lot that you're probably not intending to convey when you do that. Like, you care, you think it's important for these things, that you're using hair, for example, as which conveys that you think there's a rule, that girls have long hair and boys shouldn't have long hair. And so I think having the conversations, right, to reflect back on the child and say, why do I know? Why do we care about that, right? Or what do you know? What do you think about girls? Do you think they're any different than boys? How do you think they're different? That will give you a baseline for what the kid is thinking about. And my favorite story is a mother who was in my race study. So we gave her 4-year-old racial attitude survey. We give the mother, and then they play guess each other's attitudes, which is my favorite part. The mother guesses what the kid said in the room, and the kid guesses what the mom said in the room. And afterwards, the mom would say to us, would you show me the answers? Because I have no idea what my kid said. Like, I was just guessing blindly. And they would say, I don't know what he said because we've never had a conversation, right? I have no idea what my kid thinks about black people because I have never asked them what they think about black people. And so they don't know, and sure enough they don't. They're totally uncorrelated. The mother's, when she thinks the kid said and what the kid said, totally unrelated, no correlation. And so one of the recommendations is, well, have a conversation about it. But my favorite story is a mother who asked me and I showed her the answers, which we always did with the mother. She grabbed her kid and left, and then she wrote a blog about the experience, saying she was humiliated and embarrassed, and she got in her truck, and at first she didn't believe her kid had said that, so she said, so I'm just curious, what did you say to that lady about black people? When that lady asked you about black people, and he said, I said they were mean and dirty and they tell lies. So she was like, oh my God, he really said it. Oh my God, how did he think like it? She's like, I'm in a panic. And then I just said, where did you get that idea? Did you get that idea from me? And she said, I'm holding my breath. Lord, please don't say that idea was from me. And the kid said, I got the idea from the man at Walgreens. And she said, from a man, what are you talking about? And she said, that man at Walgreens with the puppy, and then she remembered. She had taken the kid to Walgreens, there was a homeless person with a dog outside. She went through the doors, the kid stopped when she remembered, because she had to say, come in, to look at the dog. And she said, that man told me that black people keep trying to steal his dog, because they're dirty, stealer, dishonest, right? Called him a racial epithet. And she said, my kid got his attitudes about race from a homeless person, and I didn't know because we had never had a conversation. So, ask questions to see where they're at. And now again, a lot of what you say is going to be driven by your personal values and what stereotypes you want them or not want them to know, and this is what gets hard, right? I have parents who say, I want my son to know the boys do not polish their nails, they do not wear barrettes, they do not become nurses, they do not become hairdressers, and they don't play with dogs, right? So if you want your kid to know those are things you're going to convey. And the best I can do is explain the ways in which that will constrain their child's life in a way that might not be so functional and adaptive for them, right? So if you're a boy who actually likes these things, that could really harm your relationship because you've expressed this disapproval of things they really like, and kids need support for their interests, blah, blah, blah. But you have to ask yourself, what do I want them to think about women? What do I want them to know women are like and men are like, and what they're not like, right? So when they're using a category for something that you think, whoa, use it for this thing, but don't use it here, right? It's not appropriate to think about their gender in this context.
I have a follow-up to that. So I have a child who's 2 years older, and who will say things like, usually people with long hair are girls. And so it's an accurate stereotype. Yeah. And then I feel sort of like, I'm not sure what the next step is, so it'll be like, they are, but boys could have long hair too, but then I don't know.
That's perfect. So yes, if it's true, proportionally, people with long hair are more likely statistically to be girls than boys. You're right. And there's no point denying that to a child, right? Because they're like, yeah, Mom, you're obviously an idiot because I correlated long hair with femaleness, and I know. But the next step is perfect. So what you can do is say, oh yes, you've noticed a proportional difference. You've noticed that it's more often. But let me think, do we know any men with long hair? So what you can do is build in a recognition of between group similarities, where you can always think of, oh, remember my friend Bobby, he has long hair, right? So is it only girls can have long hair? Oh, no, some boys really like hair. We know it's so, right? So some boys have long hair. And then you can say, do we know girls with really short hair? Oh yeah, right, my friend Maria, she has super short hair. It's as short as Bobby's, right? Bobby and Maria have the same hairdo. Oh, look at that. Can boys and girls have that exact same hairdo? Yes. So recognizing that within group difference, between group similarity is really useful for just trying to push kids towards that flexibility. And little kids are going to have a tendency not to be flexible. Like, it's great that he's saying usually, because most kids go right to a rule. Only girls can have long hair. And they make it this rigid rule. And you'll see as they get to be 6 and 7, they get more flexible. So you just want to keep pushing the flexibility and the idea of, yes, you've noticed a trend. There are more men firefighters than women firefighters. And then you might have a conversation about, why do we think, right? Because what you want to prevent is them thinking girls are terrible at firefighting. They're not strong, they're stupid, they can't do this, right? And that's where the discussions of stereotyping and discrimination come in, right? That people have these ideas sometimes that women aren't as strong and can't be firefighters. And do we think that's true? No, here's a woman firefighter, right? Why it's good to know her is we know there's a rule that doesn't, right, that some people endorse that's not true, that doesn't exist, she can do it. And why more women don't do it is probably because of stereotyping and prejudice. You just want to keep, and the more you can have those conversations, the more likely you will be that your kid will match your attitudes and have those same kinds of attitudes and egalitarian views later. But it takes a lot of them and repeated reinforcement of them. Anything else? And I'll just tell you, you can make mistakes. I raised 3 kids. My first biggest mistake, and it was my first kid, so I was young and naive. I was a first-year assistant professor, and my kid came home singing a song about Native Americans. He went, "Ooh, we are the red men, we build teepees," and I was horrified. So I told him about American Indians, and I told him the story of white people taking their land and killing all the American Indians, trying to kill them, and he looked at me and he said, "Did you kill any Indians?" Right? And I went, "Oh my God, he's only 4. Historical time, not so good. He thinks I've killed Indians." So you make mistakes, but you just re-explain, right? Take your best down, reflect back at what they heard you say, and then try to clarify it. And it's all good. It's way better to have those conversations than to be afraid of them.
So briefly, I just want to say that the caterers are taking the food, so grad students, anyone else who wants to please take this food. We pay for it. It hurts my heart to see it. So, and also, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to Dr. Bigler for all the things we've heard today. Thank you.